Okay, welcome everybody. Danny, if you want to turn your camera back on, that would be awesome. Thanks everyone for joining us today to come and hear about some of the exciting new business data we've got pending from the RDC. Joining us today to tell us about it is Danny Lung from Statistics Canada. Danny is a director at the Analytical Studies and Modeling branch, and he's been there for 7 years. This event, we're thankful for Statistics Canada for presenting or for co-sponsoring, and to the Productivity Partnership, which has as its mission to promote, facilitate, and fund research related to productivity. So thank you, and we'll hear from Danny.
So thanks, Grant, and good afternoon, everyone. So let me just share my screen here. All right. Can you all see the presentation?
We can.
Okay, great. Right. So today I'm going to give a presentation on the research and data from the Economic Analysis Division. Some of you may know me from before the pandemic as the person responsible for business microdata access. I'm no longer in that role. Actually, that happened as of March 2020, just when the pandemic hit, the changeover. Now responsible for the Economic Analysis Division. But I still like to kind of talk to you today because there are links between what we do and possible work in this RTC network. Specifically, the research that is done at in the division and the data that's developed, can definitely make its way into the RTCs, and I think will be useful, right? And so the talk is going to be a little bit narrower than what was advertised. I think in the description it talked about the business data overall, but here the focus really is going to be on what the what are some of the research and data activities in the Economic Analysis Division, what's going on there, and how it may relate to the CRDCN. So, but before I begin, cette présentation est en anglais, mais les diapositives pour cette présentation est disponible en français aussi. Et n'hésitez pas de me poser des questions. J'essaierai de les aborder. So, as the as the kind of outline mentions, right? I think the first kind of order of business is just to kind of tell you a little bit of what I do now that I'm no longer responsible for business microdata access. Some of the kind of the recent work using microdata, specifically our database that we released just recently on patents, and some of the recent work on survival and growth of businesses over the pandemic. And also to give you some of the updates that are coming from our division, which is the business research microdatabase. I'll explain a little bit more what that is later on, and also the follow-up to that, the business employee analytical microdata. And then I'll end off with some of the ongoing work in the division that's not complete yet, but like when it is, some of the microdata could make its way into the research data centers. So just a little bit about who we are. The Economic Analysis Division is one of the 4 in the Analytical Studies and Modeling branch. The branch itself brands itself as the Research and Modeling Incubator at StatsCan that does high quality work in a number of areas. There's 4 divisions, as I mentioned: economic analysis, the one that I'm responsible for, health, and then social analysis and modeling. And also the 4th is a strategic analysis, which aims to integrate the research in those 4 areas. So what do we do? It's very expansive, right? And so I'm really going to focus, as I say, on areas that I think may interest you, specifically in the area of microdata research. And like in the following year, this year basically, the focus will be on diversity, inclusion, business dynamics over the pandemic, and also intangible capital. If you want more information on what we do, we actually have a published work plan, a multi-year work plan, right, that you can refer to for the other areas of what we're doing, right? The division is also worth mentioning that the division is responsible for producing aggregate statistics as well, the data on the multi-factor productivity in Canada. We have an annual program for the national level, industry, and provinces, and a business dynamics program, which I'll talk a lot more about in this presentation in regards to firm entry and exit. In terms of how this relates to the research data centers, the idea here is that, as I kind of alluded to in my kind of very introductory remarks, that the data that we develop for our own studies, the idea is to make those available in the research data centers in an accessible way. And so the kind of accessible way, I mean, is the kind of creation and regular update of what I call core databases. So the first is the business research micro database, which is already in the research data centers. I'll speak more about it later in terms of details. But the idea here was that based on our experience of running the access program for business microdata, we put together a database of the commonly requested variables and made them available in the research data centers. And the idea here is to update this regularly and also add variables based on what we are doing in our own research program. The database to come, which you'll hear more about later, hopefully, it will be in the RDCs in the next few months, is I would say, the complement to the core business data. It's the kind of core employer-employee match data. And so very similar concept. Based on our experience, we put together a set of kind of core variables so that it can be easily accessed and at low cost, right? And of course, there's always the possibility of doing custom requests, right, including external data, etc., for specific projects. So I'm going to jump into the kind of the two specialized areas I wanted to talk about today. And that was the development of our Canadian patent research database and also the business dynamics. But I'll start with this first. And so I think the kind of obvious question first is like, why are we focusing on patents at all in our division? And there's a number of reasons for this. I think first and foremost is that intangible capital is becoming increasingly important for the Canadian economy in a number of areas. In terms of microdata research, one of the commonly used measure of innovative activity that is available for all firms, right? And not just like through surveys, but like in all firms in a longitudinal format is research and development expenditures. One of the drawbacks of this, of course, is that it is innovation input, right? I guess that's what they say, right? It's not really an output of the innovation process. And so one idea was to kind of supplement that data, the R&D data that's existing, with a measure of output, right? Patents have been recognized as a link to innovation. And as I mentioned, one of the reasons why we select patents is that there's an administrative database available so that we can link it to all firms so that we can track over time in a longitudinal fashion how patenting affects firm growth and survival and other activities, right? But definitely we recognize that there's limitations, right? Not all R&D leads to patents. Not all innovations are associated with patents. A lot of patents have no economic value, according to some authors. And the idea here is that it's a complement, right? It's one of the measures of the whole innovation process, but one that is relatively low-hanging fruit, right? So what exactly is this? Well, the source data is the PatStat. So this is a database put together by the European Patent Office. They collect patent applications and grant information from patent offices around the world. The version that is in the database now is 2001 to 2000. Well, it's PatStat 2018, but based on our kind of examination of the data, it's 2001 to 2015 that is really complete. It makes sense because there is a delay, right, in terms of applying and the publication of patents. I think it's like up to 24 months or 18 months, I can't remember, but it's a significant amount of time. And then, of course, the European Patent Office has to collect this information from the patent offices and process it, right? And so it's not surprising when you look at the data, it's not quite complete as the edition number, right, of the product, right? But there's a lot of information there, patent applications by where the patent was made or where the application was made to, the filing date, whether it's part of the Paris Convention Treaty, whether it's part of a family of patents, the number of applicants on the file and the number of inventors, etc. And the technology field, I think that's an important field as well, right? To this is linked to basically, I would say, variables that you find in the business research microdatabase. Very kind of basic information on like the firm profile from the business register, firm performance, financial characteristics from the corporate income tax, and the labor information from our T4 and PD7. Yeah, and to the right here, I just make the kind of the point here that the technology field variable is there, and it's interesting contrast to the industry variable that we have at StatsCan. So for more information, I provided 2 links here of our recently published papers earlier this year, right? And so here's a kind of schematic of what I'm talking about. That PatStat universe is huge. And from that, we're extracting only those applications that are related to Canada in some way. The first 2 boxes are like applications made by residents of Canada. We split it into kind of 2 groups, individual governments and other entities, which we'll deal with later. And then applications involving at least 1 Canadian resident business, which is the information we're using now. And of course, we've also set aside the applications to our Canadian patent offices, but by 2 non-residents. Just because we see that in the literature, particularly some of the papers by C.D. Howe, this is what they focus on. All patents applied for in Canada rather than by Canadian residents. So we put that in there just so that we've put that aside just so that if there's a request to kind of continue some of the work by C.D. Howe that could be available. But the focus really right now is on the applications made by at least 1 Canadian resident business. As I mentioned, these are some of the variables at the application level that we've extracted. Basically what I just said already. In terms of putting this data onto the business research microdata, the first step is to kind of aggregate this to the enterprise level. So number of applications by enterprise, by application authority, the number of inventions, and the number of patent grants, right, by year, by firm. And so what are some of the kind of things we see, like the kind of the broad patterns? First of all, there's been only a very slight increase in the patent applications filed by Canadian businesses. It's only gone up, maybe I can't see right now, but like it's probably in the 100 or 100 or so. But this hides a lot of heterogeneity, when we look at it by patent office. There's a quite relatively strong increase in applications made to the USPTO, so the US Patent Trademark Office. And this is offset offset by declines in other patent offices and at the European Patent Office. What's actually going on here? Like, why is this increase happening in the USPTO? When you dig into the microdata a little bit, what you see is that it's due to more applications disproportionately by small firms, and also firms in kind of the service industries, not in the traditional sectors where patenting is strong, like in manufacturing. This is basically exactly what I was referring to. It's a extract from the paper. You see that patent applications in the USPTO increased from 2001 to 2015 from 1,800 some to like 4,032. In 2001, small firms with employment between 0 to 19 employees are responsible for 23% of applications in 2001. But in 2015, they were responsible for 38%. And when you look at who was responsible for the change, which is like the far right set of columns, you see it's over 50.1% for 0 to 19 firms. Yeah, and so like the same thing, if you look at the industry roles, at the beginning of the period in 2001, a lot of the patenting was concentrated in manufacturing. Specifically in the, let's say in the USPTO, you see it's like 58.3%. And when you look at the kind of the last set of columns, and when you see which industries were responsible for the change in the number of applications, it's the bottom two, the professional, scientific, and technical, and other service industries that were disproportionately responsible for that increase in the USPTO. And like in the declines, it's very similar. Like most of the declines are due to these large firms when you look at for the other patent offices, right? And so kind of like one thing we could just addressed, just started to address in that paper was whether that trend mattered, right? And just the idea that, well, if you're filing into the US in the end, does that matter? Does that actually impact firm growth? No, this is just a simple, experiment on this. Yep, just looking at the chat. So yeah, so this is just a kind of a simple experiment to show whether the change in the patent behavior might matter. Simple conditional correlation. Basically, we look at whether if you filed a patent during this period, the study period, whether you had a probability, whether you had a period of high growth, right? Where the high growth is defined as, using the OECD definition of high growth, right? And so basically, the first column says that, if you filed a patent, not controlling for anything, you get like a 25.2% higher probability of experiencing a period high growth. Once you add in controls, including the usual stuff, right? Industry, other things, but also importantly, R&D expenditure, that drops to 7.5. And so that's kind of interesting in itself, because that tells you that, kind of goes in line with that, kind of my kind of reasoning at the beginning, right? That patents were important because they're a complementary indicator of innovation, right? That even controlling for R&D, patent applications are important, right? But the focus really here was to look at whether it mattered when you filed into the Canada or the US, and in the end, it doesn't, right? Once you kind of control for the observables, the impact, let's say the correlation, more precisely, the correlation between filing a patent in one of these offices and the probability of experiencing a period of high growth is very similar, like 4.4% and 4.1%. And I can't see the, because of, there's some things blocking, but like on the probability of high revenue growth, it's very similar story. The impact of SIPO and USPTO on the probability of experiencing a period of high revenue growth. Right? All right, so kind of switching gears and turning to the kind of the second portion is the survival and growth of firms over the pandemic. As I mentioned, like the division is responsible for a program on business dynamics, and prior to the pandemic, we were producing data on an annual basis and a quarterly, and focusing on entry and exit. As the pandemic started, there was a need for more timely information and also on different variables as well, not just entry and exit, but openings and closings, where we kind of say openings and closings are defined as the month-to-month transitions of like whether the firm is active or not active, and kind of the concept of entry and exit, which is kind of longer term. We put that aside at first, right? And so today I'm going to present some of that information that we have developed, just after the pandemic. Right? This is kind of interest too, right? The kind of the business survival and growth over the pandemic, because we know that there was a number of programs introduced by the government to help firms cope with the pandemic. The wage subsidy, the business loan, and also the rent subsidies. There are a lot of some information published on the usage of these programs, but less on how they impacted survival and growth. Right? So just some basic information about business openings and closings. Our last data point is in February 2022. As you see, the number of businesses dropped quite a bit, by 12% at the beginning of the pandemic, and has gradually recovered. And now there's actually more active businesses than at the beginning of the pandemic. This varies slightly across industries. Some industries where the number of active businesses is actually much greater than 100, or like much greater than pre-pandemic levels, or like professional science and technological services, information and culture. And there's some areas where the industries have not recovered as measured by the number of businesses. Mining, oil and gas, which is not a surprise because their decline was not really linked to the pandemic. Wholesale trade, and some of the industries where there's more face-to-face interactions, accommodation and food, other services, which includes personal services, and arts, entertainment, and rec. So the kind of overall numbers hides a lot of churn, right, in the data. Because although the number of businesses have recovered in the business sector, those may not be the same businesses, right? And so that this kind of graph shows a little bit about what's happening there. And so this is different because it just follows the February 2020 cohort up to the current period to see if whether they're active in January 2022. And so you can kind of translate this into like a survival rate, let's say, right? And so what this says is for the business sector, about 24% of the active businesses in February 2020 were closed in January 2022. They either didn't exist or they were kind of temporarily closed again, right? That's quite a bit of churn, right? But interestingly, if you look at periods, other 2-year periods in the past, it's actually quite similar, right? And that's kind of very similar across the industries. But before I get to that, like some of the industries where there's a bit more loss in the number of firms, was transportation and warehousing and real estate, accommodation and food services, This is not surprising. And then the ones where there wasn't as much exit: manufacturing, wholesale trade, and utilities. There's definitely patterns by firm size as well. If you are small, 1 to 5 employees, the probability of you not being in existence now or active now, I think it is lower, right? It's your survival rate was only 70%, right? Compared to larger firms, which were like 95. As I mentioned, one of the the key things that are probably going on here is the emergency support programs. Just as an example, firms that used the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy at least one time had a survival rate of 86%, compared to firms that did not use it, 67%. This, of course, does not imply the causality here. There's not really a measure of impact, because that kind of simple correlation doesn't take into account the the observables and unobservables, right, that are correlated with the survival and the usage of the business programs itself. And one example, of course, is firm size. I just show here quickly that the usage of the wage subsidy and the emergency business account to the the most popular programs increases with firm size, by and large, let's say, especially to the smaller firms, right? And so, and also, as you note from the previous slide, that the survival rate was lowest, right, for the small firms as well, right? So that is a confounding factor that needs to be taken into account, right? And I'll leave it there, because some of our analysis controlling for other variables and our attempt to control for unobservables is in this paper. And if you're interested, you can have a little bit more closer look. But I hope that gives you a a sense of the data that could be made available, right? So I'm going to turn to the updates. On the business research microdata, currently the data are covering the 2000 to 2017 variables. 2017 years. Some of the, for those that don't know, some of the the core variables are key income and balance sheet variables, investment, R&D expenditures, employment, exports, imports, and gender, the majority ownership of the business, right? In September, we hope to have an updated version to 2020 to be added in terms of number of variables. We're planning to add the patent data that I had mentioned today. Right now, it's up, as I showed, it's up to 2015. We are in the process of buying PatStat again to update the data. So hopefully we'll be able to include it in the next round in the 2020 update. But if we can, we'll have to see the data, but we'll likely have the patent data up to 2018, I would imagine, at least. We're also planning to add the robot investment data that was appearing in one of our published papers just prior to the pandemic, I think, on robot investment and firm performance. That data is up to 2017, and since we haven't replicated the study, and don't intend to at this point, that is where the data are going to end, right? We know that there's a lot more demand for more detailed geography and industry codes. When we first conceived of the project, I would say that the structure to provide more sensitive information into the research data centers wasn't up yet. But at this point, I think we're ready to provide more detailed geography industry codes. Probably, I can't remember what we're planning in geography, but like in industry codes, probably even down to the NAICS 4, right? Well, one of the things that I wanted to get some feedback today was whether there was interest in having some of that more timely data that is underlying our work on business survival and growth over the pandemic. So basically the monthly PD7 variables that were kind of used to define openings and closings, and also some of the variables on our the programs. In our paper, you saw the emergency wage subsidy, the business count, and the rental subsidy. But as you know, there are many others, like the hardest hit. I can't remember all of them, but there's many others that followed up after these ones were terminated. Yeah, that'd be some of the kind of the feedback I'm be interested in getting, right? In terms of the business employee analytical microdata, I don't know if this is actually going to be the name, but I think that is at least our working name, right? It's going to consist of core variables on workers, from the personal income tax. So there'll be like an individual file, right? But there'll also be a kind of a worker job level file that's made up of like their T4 record of employment. And it will be linked to the business data, right? And so it will be an employer-employee match database. The idea is have the data spanning from 2000 to 2019. It's not 2020 because some of the T1 data take longer to process. And so even though the business data will be to 2020, the employer-employee match data will be up to 2019. And our target release date is at the beginning of September, late August, but I think it was better to wait for the beginning of the academic year to release it, right? Okay, so quickly just about some of our ongoing work that may interest you, that may end up in the research data centers eventually. We do have a paper on business ownership among persons with disabilities. It is rather limited, but it's a start. It's on claimants of the disability tax credit, and so that could be a possible indicator. We are working on the Indigenous and Invisible minority-owned business indicators for microdata. Yeah, some of the follow-up work on patenting is looking at patenting by women-owned businesses. Maybe less of interest for the microdata research is that we've done some in the past, some estimates of GDP by firm size and GDP by city and productivity as well. And we're trying to push that down to finer geographical levels. And one example is our paper on economic activities in the areas affected by the BC floods, right? In terms of the business dynamics side, kind of one of the questions that when you see all that kind of churn in the recent period is that, how does that actually affect productivity growth? Do we see what we would normally expect to see in terms of like more less productive firms exiting, and what is the kind of the impact of that reallocation on productivity growth? There's a lot of interesting things too that you could do combined with the program data, thinking about how the programs in some sense helped help the recovery path by preserving like firm worker links or firm specific capital on the one hand, but on the other hand perhaps perpetuating some misallocation in the economy, and kind of looking at that trade-off. Now that could be very interesting, right? There's this whole idea about zombie firms that we're working on as well, developing a measure of that, not using just the publicly traded data like done in the past, but the complete universe of firms. And finally, as I think the pandemic kind of pointed out, a question about what's the difference between insolvency and exits, because people publish the bankruptcy statistics and compared to the exit statistics, and kind of was wondering like why they kind of showing different trends. And so we're doing a little paper on this using some of the data, microdata from the OSB, the Office of the Superintendent of Bankruptcy, linked to our exit data, just to kind of shed some light on like what firms file for insolvency, what firms exits, and are those two things related, right? And so that's my presentation, all 4 parts. Feedback is definitely welcome. Here's my email address. It's this kind of the standard one, so it's probably pretty easy to remember. So thank you again.
All right, thank you, Danny.
So I'm just gonna look into the, yeah.
Yeah, do you want
So I'm
to,
gonna look into the chat just to look at the questions. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So there's going to be some in the chat and some in the Q&A. Do you mind if I ask them and you answer them? And maybe that's
Oh yeah,
easy.
go ahead. Go ahead.
That way they go in order. So the first question, thank you for the presentation. Still many Canadian firms applying for patents in the US. Did you come up with a reason?
No, this is one where we didn't, no, is when you look at the paper, you'll see it's only like a kind of a highlights from the database. So maybe, you know, there's a short analysis just to introduce the database so we could make it public. And so we haven't dug into that. There is a reference in the paper to some work by Long and let's say two authors from the University of Alberta, which kind of look at why firms patent in Canada versus the US and some of the explanations there. But it's not the focus of this kind of our short paper on just describing the database. But there's definitely some work out there on that.
Okay. So our next question is from Samson Eklobo. Hi, Samson. In his current work, he's providing a competitive market for patents where firms can trade patents. He's wondering if Statistics Canada patent data provides information on patent trades or sales between firms.
Yeah, that's a real tough one because I think that's one of the drawbacks, I would say, disadvantages of using patents as an innovation indicator is that the kind of change of ownership of patents is not doesn't have to be reported to patent offices. And so there is some data on like the change in ownership, the assignee of the patent in the in our PatStat database. But we know that from the patent offices themselves that the data are spotty there because it is not part of is not a mandatory thing to report to patent offices. There are avenues of getting this information that we are thinking of. There's databases from the kind of like patent auctions, right? That could be accessed. And there's also data that could be kind of inferred from changes in firm ownership. So like for mergers and acquisitions, one firm buying another, it is possible for that when that one firm buys the other firm that it takes over their kind of patent stock. But kind of patents moving between firms that continue, it's difficult. I think it's a challenge for like for everyone working in this area. So.
Okay, so just to clarify for the next question asker, so the data is informative only at the time of the initial patent application, the one that you spoke about today?
I'm not sure what that question means, but like,
well, he was also asking in terms about of like
when
the transfers and owners. Yeah. So the question is, sort of the observation happens when the patent is applied for, when it's granted, and then there's no continuity of information about that patent. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Right. Okay. In fact, we actually don't even know when the patent was granted. We just know it was granted at some point, right? So this is one, when you look into the database, you'll see that our series on patent applications is more up to date than on patent grants, because patent grants take even longer to show up into the system, right? So,
is it possible to link patent data to the NPRI, ASM, GHG, and I don't know what those acronyms are. So if Danny also doesn't know what they are, then McDad's going to have to clarify. Yeah.
So like those acronyms are the annual survey of manufacturers and the pollutant national pollutant release inventory. And so this is some of the data that we've produced in the division in the past. It is possible to link it to those older data. We ourselves don't have a project in the works to do that, just because the annual survey of manufacturers, I can't remember what year, but it used to be a census of manufacturers. not exactly a census, but more or less, right? That over a certain threshold, we capture everyone. But after, I think, maybe 2010, it became a kind of like a take all, take some, take none survey, right? And so you have that kind of break in the ability to track firms longitudinally, right? If you link this patent data to it. Now, if you're interested in doing that type of work, perhaps this is a kind of a custom database that we could like build for you, like focusing on manufacturing from the administrative data side, linked to the pollutant registry and linked to PatStat. Yeah, we haven't, basically the bottom line is that we don't plan to continue using the ASM just because of the difficulty of kind of doing longitudinal analysis with a cross-sectional survey in the end.
Okay, thank you. So I've got 2 questions from our gracious co-sponsor, Mike Veal. He wants to know how the beam relates to the seed.
The beam is directly related to the seed. I didn't want to throw in many acronyms, but like just as the business research microdata is in some sense a kind of a core extract from what we call the National Accounts Longitudinal Microdata file, this beam is a kind of extract of the core variables from the seed, right? The seed is more of a linkage environment where there's a lot of these source data that are linkable, right? And that we pull kind of variables for a specific paper together. But the idea here is that since we wanted to kind of make things a bit more, let's say, accessible for users in the RDC, that we just create one kind of core extract, hopefully that will serve many projects, and so that people wouldn't have to ask us for like custom data all the time, so that there is some base file that would hopefully serve most uses. It may not, but as I said, the idea here is to kind of grow that set of variables over time so that you can do more and more things with it, right? But the important thing is that we don't start off with like just throwing everything in, because one of the things that, as we need to justify more and more is the statistical analytical purpose for some of the variables we put in the database. So it is very important for us to be able to kind of show that. And that's the logic behind, when we do some of our own research and create some of these derived variables like robot investment and patents, that we can then make it available in the research data centers because we have a documented analytical use for them.
So my understanding of that is that you've kind of looked through, or maybe not you personally, but there's been kind of a process of going back through the projects that were in CEDAR and kind of picking out the core variables that were common to each of those projects, and that's what's going to form the RDC version of the beam. But if there was a special need for other projects, for other variables that came out of a research proposal, it might be possible to get those in the RDC. Is that correct understanding?
Yep, that's correct. Yep.
All right, good. I passed the test. Sorry, my dad has drawn to my attention that he asked a second part of his question that I somehow missed. He asked if it's possible to distinguish between patents that are related to climate change and the environment versus the rest of the patents. Like, is there a theme or a topic or? Yeah,
there's actually a IPC code for environmental technologies. And we do kind of report the growth in that in the paper, I believe, just as like it's not one of the ones that are fastest growing or the fastest declining. But besides that one, and I think there was one more that just out of interest, we reported, and so it is possible to identify that using the IPC codes that are in PatStat.
Okay, thank you. Is there a data source that reports Q's receipts that can be reconciled with firm reports on Q's?
No, no, I don't think so. It's just because of the timing of the data, right? I think on the Q's applications, they talked about decline in revenue versus relative to different reference points, right? And so, but what we have on revenue on the administrative data side are the annual changes in revenue, right? Because they're coming from the annual corporate income tax files, which may not be corresponding to the calendar year too, right? And so there's challenges there in kind of like linking those two things up. No, some people have asked about like whether you can get the GST revenue, right, which is for large firms monthly, right? But yes, those data could be available monthly, but we know that for the vast majority of firms that don't file monthly because they're relatively small, it's annual too, right? And so there are some difficulties on that part to get like complete information.
Okay, so does StatsCan have any data on patents that originate in universities? And I guess I'll just broaden that about, you know, what does that variable look like and what other information is contained there?
Yeah, it does, right? If you kind of go back to, I will have it on the slide here. If I think this is still being shared. You know, this kind of branch here on the other application by individual government and other entities includes universities, hospitals, and other things. And so, yeah, it is possible to collect that information. And we've kind of set it aside, but we ourselves have not used it yet, but it exists, right? And we've kind of extracted that from the core PatStat data.
Okay, so that's not going to be part of the PatStat that you're talking about that might come in?
Not right away. I think we just have to get some, well, if we haven't put much thought into how the data could be used and how we could put the kind of analytical variables together. And so if someone's interested in giving us some guidance there upon what would be kind of useful for researchers, that'd be great feedback as well, so that we can start to think about doing that.
Well, there you go, Edmund. So you need to send an email to Danny, Danny Lung at Canada, is it at statcan.gc or at canada.ca?
It's both work, but our new one is statcan.gc.ca.
Okay, so yeah. Danny Lung at statcan.gc.ca and pitch him a project, and if he likes what you're selling, then maybe the university patents make their way in. So Samson asks another question about the workers' employers data providing information on the level of education of the employees, and then he clarified to say and sort of the managers of the firms. What do we know about the employees that are, if they're responsible for the patents?
Yeah, so the seed and the beam is basically built on the administrative data sources. So the tax data sources I mentioned, which is lacking, of course, some of the interesting social demographic characteristics like education and field of study and like occupation. And so, yeah, that it's not there now. It's not there now. No.
Okay, well, you know what my follow-up question is going to be. Are there any plans to bring in some of the social data? Is it even possible, given that you're working with tax filing data?
Yeah, so like for various projects, we're experimenting linking census data and other survey data to the seed, to the administrative data, to see if we can fill in blanks and also kind of impute for the ones that cannot be linked to the census, because census, for well, as you know, is long form, is where the kind of the interesting social demographic characteristics are found, right? And so some of that experimental work is ongoing, and definitely I think we could use it to produce aggregate statistics. I think we have a strategy there. But in terms of like doing some things at the microdata level, especially for small firms, right, where your imputation for your 5 workers won't matter a lot, right? Whereas when if you're a large firm like thousands of employees, that imputation is probably going to be okay when you're thinking about like the proportion of people in which occupation or which education level. And so yeah, it's work in progress. It's work in progress for sure.
All right, well, are there any other questions for Danny? Because I don't want to monopolize all the time. Okay, well, I think with that, we will say thank you. And of course, Danny put his email address on screen, and maybe he'll do it again for us. If you have any feedback on what you heard today, it would be awesome. I'm sure he would love to hear it. It would also be awesome if all of you could fill out a brief survey about today's event. that we collect for our purposes. And we'll all say thank you to Danny for coming to speak to us. And if you're interested in business data, we're going to have another business data session at our data forum in October. And we'll hope to all see you there.
Great. Thank you again.